Hello, everybody. Welcome to this lovely event. My name is Kai. I'm a social media member here at Mysterious Galaxy, and today we're celebrating the release of R.M. Romero's book, The Ghost of Rose Hill. Yay! So, R.M. Romero, oh, yes, beautiful cover. R.M. Romero is an author of fairy tales for children and adults, and in conversation with her today is Aden Polydoros, who is also a writer with a bachelor's degree in English from Northern Arizona University. We wanted to extend a special thank you to R. Romero for signing the Ghost of Rose Hill book plates, which are available through the Mysterious Galaxy website along with the book. You can find that in the link below. It's a shiny green box that reads By the Ghosts of Rose Hill and signed book plates here. So, a kind reminder that your purchase of books through Mysterious Galaxy helps us as an indie bookstore to keep doing wonderful events such as this. RM Romero will be doing an audience Q&A around the 30-minute mark, so be sure to submit all of your questions to the Ask a Question tab below. I know you're not here to watch me talk, so I'm going to disappear in just a moment. So, without further ado, let's give a warm welcome to RM Romero and Aden Polydoros. Yay!
Thank you.
All right. Yeah, see you guys later.
So this was such an amazing book, and I guess I'll just begin by reading the blurb for those who aren't quite familiar with it yet. Sent to stay with her aunt in Prague and witness the humble life of an artist, Ilana Lopez, a biracial Jewish girl, finds herself torn between her dream of becoming a violinist and her immigrant parents' desire for her to pursue a more stable career. When she discovers a forgotten Jewish cemetery behind her aunt's cottage, she meets the ghost of a kind-hearted boy named Benjamin, who died over a century ago. As Ilana restores Benjamin's grave, he introduces her to the enchanted side of Prague, where ghosts walk the streets and their kisses have warmth. But Benjamin isn't the only one interested in Ilana. Rudolf Wassermann, a man with no shadow, has become fascinated with her and the music she plays. He offers to share his magic so Ilana can be with Benjamin and pursue her passion for violin. But after Ilana discovers the truth about Wassermann and how Benjamin became bound to the city, she resolves to save the boy she loves, even if it means losing him forever. So, would you like to begin with an excerpt from this book?
Yes, definitely. So this is The Ghost of Rose Hill. In the movies, only one girl is allowed to survive the monster. There's something fascinating about that final girl, the one who leaves the haunted house, the basement, the cabin in the woods, when all others are gone. They say the final girl is the last one standing because she's pure. But they're wrong. The final girl survives because she can be just as ruthless as the monster who wants to destroy her.
Thank you. That is such a gorgeous excerpt, and I think it really strikes at the core of this story and this sense of who gets to tell stories and who gets stories told about them, and the morality play and the messages behind both horror movies and fairy tales. I thought that this was such a beautiful way of exploring Jewish identity and transplanting it in this sort of fairy tale format that we're normally deprived. Um, as you know, a lot of fairy tales have anti-Semitic coding. We're not the heroes in those stories. So I'd actually love to know a little more about your thought process behind all this and what fairy tales mean to you and what you wanted to explain with this book.
I've always been really fascinated with fairy tales because growing up in the 80s and the 90s, fairy tales were actually some of the only times that I got to see female heroines. You know, you did have characters like Gerda from the Snow Queen who went off to go rescue Kai, and you had girls who managed to escape their abusers and restart their lives. And they weren't always swinging a sword. They weren't always the strong female heroine in the sense of, you know, Hollywood, but they were more layered than a lot of what I was getting from more modern media. They weren't just there to be rescued, they were the core of the story. But like you were saying, Aden, a lot of these fairy tales do have anti-Semitic coding. And there's some that are absolutely blatant about it. The Brothers Grimm story, The Jew and the Thorn, that's a really horrible story. It is not actually featured in many of the collections because it is so rabidly anti-Semitic. And there's been arguments about stories like Rumpelstiltskin. Is that an anti-Semitic fairy tale or not? So I think that it's a really fascinating way for marginalized people to sort of reclaim these things that maybe we loved in childhood but weren't fully aware of all the implications of, to say, well, I like these things, so I'm going to center myself in them and the people like me.
I think that's beautiful. And I I know reading this story for the first time, I was just really taken by the way that, in some way, it's sort of I feel like it redeems fairy tales, and sort of really just, as you said, reclaims them. Um, as I was reading, it really struck me um, how useful the the format you used was, designed to write it in verse. I felt that that did a great job of not only being able to really drive home these important passages like the excerpt you just read, but also gave it this very beautiful, whimsical quality. I'd like to know more about your writing process with this book. Like, for example, did you originally decide to do it in verse, or was this something you later chose to do?
Originally, it was not in verse, but originally it was a middle grade novel, and it really had no plot. I had a premise. A girl is sent to go live with her aunt in Prague during the summer, and she finds a Jewish cemetery that has been neglected. And in that cemetery, there's a ghost. And that is as far as I got because that's a scenario, that's not a story. It wasn't until I was browsing the Folklore Thursday tag back when I was on Twitter and came across the story of the Vodnik, which is a Czech legend about a river spirit who keeps the souls of the drowned in his teapot. And I thought, well, I have a ghost character. What if this river spirit was somehow involved in anchoring him to Prague long after he had passed away? And I started writing it in verse as a challenge to myself. I had always written poetry from about as a probably teenager on, but I never considered myself a poet because poetry, the sort you read in high school and college, it doesn't have many speculative themes. Occasionally you get, say, an Anne Sexton who makes some vague fairy tale references, but it's never fully saturated in magic. But then I got into grad school and I started reading other types of poetry, particularly speculative poetry of Catherine M. Valente and Theodora Goss and Shara Lipkin, who showed me that, yes, you can tell a fairy tale, you can tell a fantasy or even science fiction story in verse. So that's why I decided to go ahead and try it. And it actually I took to it very, very naturally. I felt like this was the only way that I could possibly tell this particular story.
I I have to agree there. I think it's a wonderful format for the book, and I think that it achieves so much in both really illustrating Ilana's character and bringing her to life, and just I thought it was fantastic. I'd like to know a little more about your idea behind the book, and also if your volunteer work played into it as well.
The volunteer work absolutely did. Prior to the pandemic, every summer, I would go to Poland and once to Ukraine to work in Jewish cemeteries there. There's hundreds and hundreds of Jewish cemeteries in Poland, and there is a Polish Jewish community there still, but it's very small, and they don't have the resources to try and maintain all of these cemeteries, especially the ones out in the country. They're very far from the hubs of Krakow and Warsaw, which is where most of the Jews of Poland live. So that was the work that I did. I worked with American groups, local Poles, Jewish descendants from Israel and the United States and other in Australia, of many other countries. And I wanted to write a story about that because that has become such an important part of my life, trying to preserve Jewish heritage in these places, because Poland especially, we often talk about Poland as a graveyard, and many Jews are very hesitant to even visit Poland because, well, it's nothing but a graveyard. There's nothing there anymore, and it can be very difficult to be there sometimes. But in my view, if it is a graveyard, then we are obligated to take care of those graves, to both honor the memory of people who are gone and to also honor the history there. Because Jews lived in Poland for 800 years. So much of thriving culture and beliefs and stories comes from that area of the world.
Yeah. I think that also writing about Jewish history in books and sort of giving us a place in literature as well is also so important, because I know that so many books don't explore Jewish history except for the Holocaust, and I think it's just really great when books go further and help show readers that Jewish history is more than just those years. It's more than just genocide, and I think that's great. My other question is, sorry, were you going to add something?
Oh, no. Go ahead.
Sorry. Okay. Yeah. So I also want to talk about the importance of intersecting identities, because your main character is biracial and Jewish, and I'd love to know more about that. And I know for me, it's very important to write both queer and Jewish characters, because I feel like readers tend to really just say, okay, is this reader going to be Jewish or are they going to be queer? And they don't realize that not that people have so many other identities. And also, I think people, even Jews, tend to ignore that there are many Jews of color, and that Jewish history is not just restricted to Eastern Europe. So I'd love to know more about your thoughts on that.
Growing up, I almost never saw my own identity reflected in any fiction, be that movies, books, television. My dad is Cuban. My mom is white. So I wanted to write a story about a girl who was like me, who came, who lives in Miami like me, who has, like you were saying, this intersection of different identities. She is made up of, Alana, the main character, is made up of so many different pieces. She has two parents who are exiles. One is from Cuba, the other is from the Czech Republic. Both of them fled the communist regimes there, much like my father's family fled the communist regime of Castro, and so many of my friends in Eastern Europe have memories of communist oppression in places like Poland and Ukraine. And I think it is important that young people see themselves and understand that all identities have nuance, and that we're we are the whole sum of our parts. We are not just one thing. We are informed by many different lived experiences and many different backgrounds and all different kinds of family history, because Jews don't only look one way. We are not all from Eastern Europe. We don't all live in New York City. We have a very unique history, all of us.
Yeah, I think that's beautiful, and I think that's so important in young adult literature and all literature to show that, and really just help people realize that there are so many different ways to be Jewish that go beyond what we normally see in the mainstream. I was thinking about the importance of names in your book. I feel like for fairy tales in general, names are of such great significance, and I'd love to know a little more about the role that names play in your book, and also if any of the characters had previous names in earlier drafts.
Ilana was always Ilana. It just seemed to suit her so well. And Ilana's last name is Lopez. And Lopez was the maiden name of my Cuban grandmother. It also means son of Lope, which means son of wolf. And wolves always have a fascinating part to play in fairy tales, where sometimes they are the villains, Little Red Riding Hood, Peter and the Wolf. And in Eastern European fairy tales, sometimes they're actually the helper. You get stories like Yvonne and the Grey Wolf, where the Grey Wolf is actually the guide of this young man named Yvonne, who is Yvonne is never the brightest crayon in the box in these fairy tales. He makes terrible mistakes. So he has this animal helper, and the animal helper is terrifying. I mean, if you've ever seen a wolf standing next to a person, you see how enormous they are. So I wanted to give Ilana a name, a surname, a family name that reflected the fierceness of that side of her family, especially because her mother is Jewish and Cuban and managed to survive so much, and that Ilana herself must learn to have sharp teeth in this story because she does go up against a monster, and the monster's last name is Wassermann, which literally translates to waterman in German, and he is a river spirit. And he was originally a river spirit in Germany and then is sent into exile and becomes a river spirit in Prague. So every character in this story is in some way an exile.
Thank you. Sorry, it's a bit slow, so I just want to. That brings me to another question. I know you've mentioned exile and the role that each character is sort of an outsider, even the antagonist, and I thought that was really interesting, and I was hoping you might be able to tell us a little more about the significance of that, and why you decided to go with that.
I think that reflects both the Cuban side of my heritage and then being a Jew. For so long there was this idea that, we are in the diaspora, we are in exile. And that was kind of a defining feature of Judaism, is where, we are in exiles, we exist, we have moved to many, many different countries since, the year, since, the Romans exiled us. And there's a lot of, Cuban exiles living in Miami as well. So I wanted all of these characters to have that one trait. Exile is also a very liminal state. And all of these characters are in a liminal place. Ilana was born on an island that is between the land and the sea. Benjamin, the ghost, is between life and true death. He is hanging out in that in-between space. And then you have the antagonist, who is in exile from his own country of origin, but he's also on the boundary of, he looks human, but he's not. And I think that the most interesting magic comes from that gray area of is it magic? Is it real? Where is the intersection? And in a city like Prague, it's really easy to imagine that there is magic there, that you're just not quite seeing it, or maybe you're seeing it from the corner of your eye. And that story is very steeped in legends as well. That's where the story of the golem comes from, for instance.
I think it's really wonderful to hear about your the thought you've put into this, the meaning and the significance of these details in the story. I think it adds so much, and it really shines in the pages. You can tell that everything you've put into the story, every word, is deliberate and has meaning and significance. And that really stood out to me as I was reading. I was wondering, are there any other questions related to the story you'd like to talk about before I segue into more general writing-related questions?
This story comes from a lot of different places, whether that is love of music, love of art. My editor, when she acquired it, called it a love song to the Jewish dysphoria, which I thought was like, oh, that's pretty much what this is. It's celebrating all of these different elements that make up Jewish history and Jewish life.
I think that's gorgeous. So I was wondering, just in general related to writing, what's the best advice you've received over the course of your writing career? And also, what's the worst?
I think the best writing advice that I ever got was actually write what scares you, because what scares you is very personal. If you're sort of afraid to go there, like, oh, can I actually pull this story off? Am I being too vulnerable with this story? That's really where the best and most heartfelt writing comes from. The Ghost of Rose Hill is the most personal book that I've ever written. And it's a book that I am very proud of because of that, because it reflects so much of who I am. It reflects so much of the things that I really value, and that is, memory, taking care of the dead, legends, fairy tales, strong female characters, male characters who are strong but also gentle and kind. And I think the worst is, I'm never someone who really writes to trend. Trend changes very, very quickly. And by the time you're done with a book, the trend has already shifted to something else. So you'll write what you're passionate about, not what you think that everyone else will be passionate about.
So yeah, sorry that it's cutting out a bit on my side, the feed. So I lost a bit at the end. I wasn't. Yeah. Yeah, I definitely agree that writing from your heart, writing um, from your own experiences, that really shines through in the writing, and it touches a lot of people as well. I think that when you discuss topics, when you discuss, genuine feelings, it really helps build empathy, build a connection. Um, I think that's great. My other question is, who's your favorite character in the book?
My favorite character is Benjamin. He is the ghost boy. He's a 16-year-old Jew who died in Prague in the 1920s, and he's a talented artist. He is very kind, he is very gentle, and he can also be very fierce when the people that he loves are threatened. And he forms a very genuine bond with Alana, the heroine, based off of their love of art. He was just such a joy to write.
Thank you. And also, I guess in a similar line of questioning, sorry, it's cutting out. How do you convince yourself to keep writing when you're stuck or when it's difficult? I'd love to know more about your process behind, like, how do you deal with writer's block, for instance? And did you have any with this book?
This book took me a fairly long time to write. It's about 30,000 words, and I think it took about 3 months to get a draft done, which for me is very slow. I can sometimes draft 50,000 words in a single month. I follow the National Write a Novel standard of, if you write 1,700 words a day, you more or less have at least part of a book, at least a fairly good skeleton of a book. This book did flow very naturally. I just kept, whenever I'd say, okay, what's going to happen next? I'd just think about it for a few minutes. I listened to a lot of classical music as I wrote this, because music plays such a central role in Alana's life as someone who wants to become a violinist, and then the next thing would pop up. When I do have writer's block, I try to look for inspiration elsewhere, and that could just be going for a walk to clear my head. That could be returning to books or movies that I find interesting, or even diving into fairy tales and folklore. Because the great thing about fairy tales and folklore is that you can just steal from them. No one actually owns these things anymore, so you can just take bits and pieces from them, and you don't have to use the entire thing. You don't have to do a straight up retelling of anything. You could just take little chunks and mix them together into a very interesting stew to come up with something that is entirely your own, but that people will recognize elements from.
Yeah, I think that adding in those sort of elements and tropes and these fixings of fairy tales is a great way of really conveying that sort of atmosphere you're aiming for, and that shines in this book. My other question would be, I think I'd love to know more about advice you have for readers as well, especially for Jewish readers, or sorry, writers, in terms of writing books, getting them published.
I think that there are so many fascinating parts of Jewish history to be explored, and there are so many really incredible folk tales out there that you can even find. There's even classes on the YIVO Institute that you can take about Eastern European folklore that always have elements of horror and fairy tales in them. I think nowadays Jewish people and Jewish children especially need to see themselves as the heroes and heroines of different stories, of their own stories, and to see themselves as more than victims. I have written a Holocaust book. I may end up writing another one someday, but I also want to explore different elements of Jewish life. And I think always write from the heart, always write for what matters, because what matters to you, because editors, agents, these people all will pick up on how heartfelt these stories are, and it really does add to the characters and bring them to life.
Yeah. Sorry, I can't tell if you're still. It keeps. Yes. Sorry, it's breaking up on my end. I just want to make sure you're at the end of the answer. Yeah. Yeah. So I definitely agree that it's so important to bring these emotions and these identities to publishing, and I think the more Jewish books we get, it'll really help expand this idea that Jewish fiction is restricted to the Holocaust. Um, are you still here?
Yes, I am.
Okay, yeah, sorry. On my side, it gets all messed up. Yeah, so I would love to actually talk a bit more about the way that horror and fairy tales intersect, and your thoughts on sort of combining, both horrifying moments in history, or really drawing out the horror that runs at the belly of fairy tales. Just your whole idea of how those two genres interact.
Fairy tales, a lot of them, and especially the older ones, tend to be very graphic. You get a lot of girls getting their hands cut off, or people demanding the hearts of their children, or the cannibal witch from Hansel and Gretel. So I think it's very easy to amp up those elements and to make it into a full-blown horror book. The Ghost of Rose Hill is a lot like a fairy tale in that the horror is there. It's a subtle undercurrent underneath it where it is a love story. There's a lot of talk about, it's a lot about Jewish joy as well as Jewish sorrow. It is the feeling of walking through Prague and seeing the beautiful synagogue there. But then you go inside the synagogue and there are names on the walls of all the Czech and Slovak Jews who were murdered during the Holocaust. And to me, that is a horror in and of itself, that there are always chapters of history that are very dark, and then you have these beautiful celebratory chapters. And that really ties into fairy tales as well. One of my professors at my MFA program, Theodora Goss, has what she calls the Heroines Journey, which is a fairy tale version of the hero's journey that focuses on female characters. And a quote I always remember from that is, "The heroine never dies in the dark woods. She is always able to make her way out of them." And I think that's true for the best horror movies as well, because the best horror movies have the heroes conquering the monster, I think. You look at the most infamous horror, whether that is Stephen King's It or The Silence of the Lambs, and it does involve the heroes descending into the dark, fighting the monster, and then being able to leave. And the same is true as fairy tales. So I think that they are actually genres that gel very well together.
I definitely agree, and I think I think that was a touching response. Yeah, I'm trying to think of other questions. I've reached the end of what I was thinking about. Although I do want to ask you what kind of research you did as well when writing this book, because you can tell a lot of research and thought went into it.
I was in Prague for a week in 2017. I took my teenage sister there, and we ended up just wandering around, seeing different things. We used the Atlas Obscura website, which if you're traveling, I absolutely recommend typing in the city you're going to. You can find the most fascinating, slightly off the beaten path museums and art galleries. The art gallery that is in this novel that Alana's aunt owns is based off of one that my sister and I went to, where there were all these amazing paintings of fairies and nymphs and mermaids, and it was all designed to kind of look like a fairy grotto. And this was something that I found on Atlas Obscura. And on the day I arrived, when I was still extremely jet lagged, my sister said, "I'm going to go to sleep." I said, "No, I'm going to go on a tour, a walking tour of the city center of Prague that focuses on 20th century history." So the tour guide was pointing out things like the bullet holes that are still on the walls and the door frames for when the Czech people finally rose up and kicked the Nazis out at the end of the war. Or in the center square of Prague, some of the stones are actually Matsevo. They are Jewish headstones that were taken from a village outside of Prague, not even by the Nazis, actually by the Soviets. They said, "Well, there's no Jewish community here to care for these headstones anymore. Nobody cares. We need building material for," it was some anniversary celebration that they needed the square to look lovely for. So they took these granite headstones and used them to fix the cobblestones there, and people are still walking on them every single day. I do find that going to these places that I'm writing about is very helpful, or if I can't go to them, to actually use Google Street View I think it's really easy because then you can move back and forth, you can go down roads. Even if you've been there, you can remind yourself of the way that a city is laid out, because every city really has a spirit in and of itself. Every place has a character. And I always want the places to be a character in my work. Even in my debut novel, The Dollmaker of Krakow, which takes place in Krakow, Poland, there's a lot about the city there. It's another very enchanted city that has a lot of folklore woven in with the real history. And that does go back to the idea of magic on the fringes of reality.
Yeah, thank you. My other question is, what is the one thing you really want readers to take away from this book?
I want them to take away a sense of strength. The main character, Alana, really doesn't understand her own strength at first. She's sort of floundering. She's torn between what her parents want and her own passion. And she doesn't quite have enough confidence to pursue that passion, because being an artist is very challenging, both because of the rejection, both because we live in a capitalist society that doesn't overvalue artists and frequently doesn't pay us very well. But she does find her strength, and she finds her strength in protecting what matters to her and pursuing what matters to her, whether that is playing music or trying to help free some ghosts who are being tied to the city for very nefarious reasons. She discovers that there are certain things that she's willing to fight for. And I hope by the end of this book, readers can draw that same inner strength into themselves and say, no, I have more power than I think I do. Especially marginalized readers who feel like their power is regularly being taken away. We still have that strength within us.
Thank you. I think that's beautiful. I'm going to move into the audience questions now, and I'd like to encourage everyone who is watching, if you haven't already put a question in the chat, in the question box, now's the time. So let's begin with, can you talk a bit about your next book, and is it as personal as this one?
The next book that I have, it's actually coming out from Peachtree Teen next summer. It's called A Warning About Swans, and it is about a swan maiden named Hildy who is living in the woods of Bavaria. And she has her magic cloak that allows her to transform into a swan stolen by a greedy baron who wants to use her magic for his own ends. And while she's imprisoned by this baron, she meets a young Jewish artist named Franz, who can paint the souls of people. They see exactly who everyone is. And the two of them have to work together in order to get her magic cloak back. And it all takes place in King Ludwig's fairy tale castle outside of Munich. And I would say that this book is personal in a different way. It draws a lot from my fascination as a child with fairy tales, with mythology, especially Norse mythology, and also what it's like to be a young woman, especially who wants to be more than what her destiny has laid out for her. I also have been to that area of Bavaria, and it is incredibly magical. Those forests, you can really see where the Brothers Grimm took their inspiration from. Like that, there's magic in those words. There just has to be.
I can't wait to read it. Is it also going to be a novel in verse?
It is. It's a second novel in verse.
I can't wait to see the way you really bring the story to life that way. The next question is, when did you start to fall in love with the stories behind cemeteries?
I've always been really interested in cemeteries. When I used to take the school bus to school in elementary school, we drove past this cemetery, this 19th century cemetery every single day. And all the other kids were scared of it. And they would do that thing where you're supposed to hold your breath as you go past the cemetery, lest the ghost like sneak into your mouth. And I was like, no, that would actually be kind of cool. I want to meet a ghost. And then when I was a teenager, I would go hang out in that same cemetery and just sit in the middle of it because it was really peaceful. You couldn't hear the cars in the very center. There was never anybody in it. There was all these beautiful 100-year-old oak trees and a little brook. And I would take my girlfriends there. I was like, yeah, let's go on a date in the cemetery. So that fascination has been there for a very long time.
I love that story and the meaning behind them. What is your favorite piece of history that you learned about a certain tombstone?
Let's see. Jewish headstones, actually, each, the carvings on them are very symbolic. And one of the most interesting ones, and also very sad ones that I learned, is when you see a willow tree that has a broken branch on it on a Jewish headstone. It means that this was a young person who died young, that they were maybe only a child or a teenager. So whenever you see that, I think, oh, this person, their life was cut short in some way. You also have the different symbols for different, like the priest, the Cohen. There, it's almost like the live long and prosper symbol. It's the two hands that get carved on top of it. So if you see this on a Jewish headstone, it means a Cohen was buried there. Or you get the pitcher, which means that there's a Levite buried there. Women often have it looks like, the candelabra on there because women are the ones who light the candles for Shabbat.
I had no idea. I think that's so fascinating. What does it mean to maintain a Jewish cemetery? The person who asked this says they find it really interesting.
So a lot of these cemeteries get very overgrown during the summer months because in Eastern Europe, you get a lot of rain, you get a lot of moisture. So it involves a lot of things like cutting down weeds, cutting down stinging nettle. There's a cemetery in the town of Oswiecim, which is actually the town where the Auschwitz concentration camp is, where the stinging nettle will easily get as high as I am. And we have to get in there with weed whackers to cut it all down. So people who come to visit their relatives won't be attacked by stinging nettle, which is the worst plant ever. It involves things like if there's any bushes, pruning them back. It can involve cleaning the headstones as well. You have to be very delicate because some of these headstones are, 100, 200 years old. I've also worked with a forensic archaeologist from the University of Staffordshire in the United Kingdom to do surveys of these cemeteries. And that involves things like measuring how large they are, using ground penetrating radar, which it looks like a little radio, and we put it on a wagon and we very slowly drag it in a grid across the cemetery to get a better idea of what is under the ground there. Because in a lot of these cemeteries, the headstones are not in their original places. The headstones were often uprooted to build roads. Sometimes they were dumped in local rivers. Sometimes they were taken after the war for, like I mentioned, building materials. And then people slowly return them. Descendants, people who just randomly find them. You find them in very strange places too. People will be redoing their barn and they'll realize that one of the stones leading up to it was a headstone. So they bring it to the Jewish cemetery because they're like, this is terrible. I didn't know this was even a thing. And yeah, it'll also involve taking photos of headstones and uploading them into a database so people can see where their relatives were buried. And then later, if they want to visit the cemetery, they can actually find it based on these databases.
I think that's so fascinating. It's always been interesting to me the way that in many places in Eastern Europe, Jewish history seems to be sort of engulfed and buried, and so many synagogues that are no longer their town names that have been changed or that aren't even towns anymore. And I think that your volunteer work is so touching because it really just sort of reminds people that Jews lived here, that we had history here, that these were people once. And I think that's so fascinating. What books and authors have inspired your writing style?
See, I would say that In terms of fantasy, I grew up reading the Chronicles of Narnia, which it took me a very long time to realize that they were Christian allegory, because I read The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe when I was like 4 years old. And I just thought, wow, this girl goes through this door and there's a magic lion and it's really cool. And then I hit about 11 and I read The Last Battle and I went, wait. And then I started putting together all the pieces and was a little bit disappointed, but I still find the writing style that C.S. Lewis uses to be very charming, because he engages directly with the reader. It's almost like you're listening to someone in your living room tell a story. Catherine M. Valente's... Oh, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I just, there was something I wanted to ask you about that specifically. So many times I've heard that portal fantasies cannot be Jewish, that Jewish stories sort of better fit sci-fi. And I'm wondering if you've heard the same and what your thoughts are on that.
I have. I think there's an essay called, I think it's Why There Is No Jewish Narnia, that was floating around a while back. I think it's probably a very old article at this point. And I disagree. You look at everything from the Torah to the Talmud, and you get these magical elements cropping up, whether that's the Witch of Endor raising ghosts, or in the Talmud, there's a reference to this place called Bilali, which is a magic forest that has all these beasts in there that almost sound like unicorns. And I've actually written a Jewish proto fantasy that's on submission with publishers right now that I based on the idea of Bilali, where I made it this magical forest that a Jewish girl goes into in order to rescue her brother. And I drew entirely from Jewish folklore. And I drew entirely from the women of the Torah, because she encounters all of these legends about the 7 prophetesses. So I think that Judaism really lends itself very naturally to fantasy, not just sci-fi, even though I think we have an impression of a lot of sci-fi stories have a very Jewish bend to them, whether that is, the Jewish influence on Star Trek, or even something more recent like Battlestar Galactica, which is about a group of people who survive a genocide and then have to go find a new homeland.
Yeah, and then of course also comic books as well, of course, I feel. I know I interrupted you. Are there any other authors you have been inspired by?
Let's see. Catherine Valente's Deathless had an enormous influence on me, because that was one of the first times that I had encountered folklore from Eastern Europe, actually. And I started to really dig into that afterwards as well, because it was very different than the Brothers Grimm that I had grown up with, or the French fairy tales. And it was a little bit darker, but I think it really reflects that region of the world very well, because the woods in there, they're not tame. They're shadows of that feel, I think, mostly just because of the history there. You go into these forests in Poland and Ukraine, and you wonder what happened here, because that area of the world has been subjected to so much conflict, and obviously that is still ongoing.
Yeah. One author that also came to mind as I was reading her book, in the way that she also sort of does a dark twist on fairy tales, is Angela Carter. I'm wondering if you've read any of her stories as well.
I have. In graduate school, I did, when I was first exploring fairy tale retellings in depth, because that was when I became very interested in it. I would read all of these different retellings and fairy tale inspired books as well.
Thank you. And also, the next question is, what inspired your magic system, and what was the process of creating it?
So, as a Latina, I draw, most of my work falls in the category of magical realism. And magical realism is that liminal magic. It is about the magic that exists on the outskirts of reality and occasionally encroaches in, but is also very interwoven in reality. My own family history from Cuba Some of the things that happen sound magical. There's a lot of mysterious disappearances in the middle of the night, impossible flights out of a country, superstitions that even my extremely rational computer programmer father will still engage in. Like, yeah, don't go under a ladder. Always throw salt over your shoulder. Don't bring seashells into the house. So I picked a lot from that about Alana naturally believes in magic because all of her family history is filled with miracles, and usually miracles of miraculous escapes. That shouldn't have been possible. It happened anyway. And I picked, when it came to ghosts, I didn't really use the typical horror movie tropes for ghosts because I can't find ghosts to be scary. Maybe because I'm in so many cemeteries, but ghosts seem more wistful and sad to me. So I decided that was the way I wanted to go with my ghosts, where they're not monsters. They're not trying to take Alana's life. They long for life, but they realize that their own lives are over, and they are existing in a space that is neither fully integrated with the world, but they haven't been able to cross over yet.
I think that's great, and I also think that examines the way that in a lot of fairy tales and a lot of stories, who's portrayed as a monster and who's portrayed as heroes. I think that helps, really explore that theme. The other question was, sorry, were you? Oh, no. Everything seems to have a meaning in your book. What was your favorite hidden meaning to craft?
My favorite hidden meaning. Let's see. My favorite hidden meaning. I really worked hard to always integrate the theme of water into the book because Alana does, like I said before, she lives in Miami Beach, which is an island. She goes to Prague, which has a river running through it. And the river is both sinister and empowering. There's a line at the very end of the book about talking about how Jews cross borders like water. So water can be a form of creation. It can be of sorts of strength, and it can also be very destructive. So there's always the theme of water, of Alana being tied to one body or another, that flows throughout the book.
I think that's fascinating. I know in my own writing, my own research for The City Beautiful, I also explored, the traditional burial process and the way that bodies before being buried are purified with, water, whether it's in a mikveh or a certain quantity of in buckets. And I think the use of water imagery in your book is really just fascinating.
Thank you.
The last question we have, and I'd encourage other viewers to add more to chat, is there a certain playlist you listen to while writing this book?
There is, and it's actually on my Spotify, which I can link on my Instagram account and on my website. There was a lot of classical music involved, and there was also a lot of Lindsay Sterling, who is the violinist who also, she'll play violin and she'll do ballet. And there was one particular song called Lost Girls that I feel like encapsulates the whole tone of the book that I would just listen to over and over again. I also spent a lot of time listening to the Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse soundtrack as I wrote this. So, because my music taste is very eclectic, as you will see from the playlist.
I think soundtracks are great, and I know for me, I just find them effective in getting you in the right emotional mindset, and I feel like that, since that's what they're made for, it really helps during scenes. There aren't any more questions, but I do want to ask you, is there anything else you'd like to talk about as well before we finish up?
I can't think of anything, but thank you for all of your thoughtful questions, Aden, and thank you to the audience for asking such thoughtful questions as well. It's been really great to talk about this book with all of you.
It was such a pleasure. Thank you so much for having me. I adored this book, and I think it's going to really get to the hearts of Jewish readers. It's going to really show people the representation they want and need. And I think now more than ever, that's wonderful.
And your books are equally wonderful, Aden. If you want more Jewish representation books, definitely check out his, both that have been published and that are forthcoming. I'm very excited about it.
Thank you.
I love you both so much. That was such a great conversation.
Thank you.
Yeah, I always love learning about like cemeteries and also about Jewish history. Like I have quite a few Jewish friends, and I love like comparing like my own learnings and actually real and stuff like that. So super valuable stuff. Glad that Jewish people are getting more representation through your art. So thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for inviting us. This was wonderful.
Yeah, I really enjoyed it. I learned a bunch as well that I didn't know about, cemeteries, and it's just really fascinating to hear, even just more about your volunteer work.
It is super great work. I'm very excited to be going back to doing it, even if I won't be excited to see the Polish mosquitoes, which you can definitely see where like the vampires from the Witcher books came from. I'm like, oh yeah, no, he was just talking about mosquitoes.
Oh, scary. They are little vampires. I do agree. Yep. Yeah. Okay, well, thank you again. But before we go, where can we find you both on social media?
So my social media, I have rmromero.com is my website, and I'm most active on Instagram, which is rmromeroauthor on Instagram.
Awesome.
For me, my website is adenpolydoros.com, but you can also find me on Twitter and Instagram under the same name, more so on Twitter than Instagram.
Okay, great to know. Again, thank you both so much for making this event happen. Yes. And thank you to the audience for being such a great audience and being good listeners and typing in the chat and asking questions. It was also fun to read.
Thank you all so much.
Yeah, of course.
Thank you so much for inviting us.
Yeah, of course. You both have a great night or day wherever you are, as well as the audience. So we hope to see you guys again. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.